Perfect. Well, welcome everyone. For those I don't know, I'm John Crow. I'm the Renewable Energy Programs Director for USDN. Very happy to be welcoming you back to the second of our three-part series on broadly beneficial clean energy planning. I keep my remarks brief so we can get right to it, particularly since most of you were on the first call, but I did want to just give a reminder about the purpose of this training. We're really here to focus on the intersection of clean energy planning, equitable community and stakeholder engagement, and also thinking about quantitative approaches, with a particular focus on scenario analysis. And I think the intersection of these three topics is really where we intend to focus our time. And as we mentioned last time, these are each in and of themselves really robust topics, and a lot has been written, a lot of resources have been created, a lot of support is being offered on each of them individually and in various combinations. We're not going to try to duplicate or be comprehensive on each of those topics. And to that end, one of the resources the training team has been putting together is compiling a list of specific resources that go deeper on some of these topics. And I think Eric will be saying a little bit more briefly at the end of our call about that resource list. So if you can go to the introduction slide, Eric. I'm very pleased to welcome back Eric Makris, Ted Wong, and Lacey Shaver from the World Resources Institute, and Yorong Ji from Greenlink Analytics, all of whom you heard from last time. Also excited to welcome Matt Cox, who is also from Greenlink Analytics, who'll be leading a scenario modeling demonstration later in the call, and Kate Johnson from DC's Department of Energy and Environment, who will be sharing more about some of the ways the district has used scenario data and scenario analysis in their community engagement processes. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric, who will give a recap of the overall training series and talk a little bit more about today's session. Eric.
Awesome. Thanks so much, John. Really appreciate it, and great to have you all back and such a great group. I just wanted to quickly summarize this series, where we've been and where we're going. So you can see the overall outline of the series. Last month we did session 1, focused on stage setting and baseline data. Today we're focusing on defining and modeling scenarios. And next month we'll be focused on turning scenarios into policies. And as you all know by now, we also have this test exercise for scenario planning that we're focused on throughout this series that is focused on providing detailed outputs for these 12 level 1 cities, but I think is hopefully relevant and informative examples for all the participants in the series. So today we're focused on reviewing the baseline results, the indicator maps that were produced as a result of your inputs from the last session, and beginning the process of selecting scenarios and defining those so they can be modeled, and we can look at those results in more detail in the next session. So a reminder about kind of our theory of change behind this training. It's about the intersection of two things as they apply to clean energy planning. So scenario planning, information is power. Having better data can inform help us to decide where we want to go. But data doesn't provide us anything without a focus provided from our values and the voice of the people that we serve. So thinking about that primarily from this equity focus, the approach of understanding how equity relates to clean energy planning in our cities. In the last session, we focused on equity and inclusive stakeholder engagement, and particularly the emphasis on understanding opportunities for stakeholder engagement throughout the planning process. We also described scenario planning. What are the different components and steps of scenario planning? We focused on selecting indicators and baseline data. We're going to be talking about some of the outputs of what we talked about last time in just a few minutes. So this is another way of looking at where we've been and where we're going. The three planning components that are highlighted are the ones we're focusing on today. Our baseline, where are we now? Scenarios, what are our possible pathways? And then beginning to understand the impacts of those possible pathways. What are the likely outcomes of what those scenarios would produce? So by the end of today, hopefully you will be feeling comfortable interpreting and communicating your baseline indicator data, understanding the process of defining clean energy scenarios and how to do that through an inclusive stakeholder-driven process, being familiar with different models for scenario modeling, our different methods for scenario modeling, and being ready to develop scenarios for your community. Of course, this is an hour and a half, so this is going to be a lifelong journey, but hopefully this will be give you a helpful head start on some of these items. So the specific agenda, there are 7 items we're going to cover in the next hour and a half. There's a lot to fit in here, including discussions and hearing from you, focused on communicating baseline, interpreting your baseline, developing and modeling scenarios. We're going to hear this case study from the District of Columbia. Thank you, Kate, for being here. We're going to introduce the scenario calculator. That's going to be the tool that we're going to ask you to use for the homework after this session. And we'll be describing next steps from here. Also, we've reserved an additional 30 minutes at the end for optional question and answers and discussion. Would love it if you would and talk about additional things we didn't get to in the core session. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ted to talk about principles for communicating baseline data.
Okay, thanks. Slide. So just a reminder, the baseline data set is a community snapshot that's built out of indicators that the stakeholders have identified as being important to them. So here's a list of some examples, and these examples include demographic, economic, housing, and public health variables. But of course, only your stakeholders know what information is most important to them. Slide. So one of the key functions of the baseline, of course, is to give the group a sort of status report on the indicators. But one of the messages that we want to run through this entire training is that you shouldn't be collecting data just for the sake of collecting data. It should be used to structure and drive the substantive discussions. So, for example, discussions about how stakeholders' perceptions of the state of the community in terms of environmental indicators, distributions of burdens, whatever, how these perceptions align with or are different from what the data say. The baseline helps the group to establish a common set of reference points so that you all are talking about the same city, the same experiences, the same values. And of course, among these common reference points will be your shared goals both for the city and for your planning process. Slide. So you can think about discussing the baseline as a process of moving from the specific to the general. So for example, start by looking at one indicator at a time, as a suggestion. Looking at one indicator at a time helps to ease people into thinking in terms of the data. And at the same time, it gives you an opportunity to ask questions like, does this asthma map reflect your experience in your neighborhood or your job or your family? And after looking at individual data points, you can get broader. You can ask things like, well, what happens when we look at this indicator and this other indicator at the same time? Do we see any patterns? Do the patterns seem correct? Do they seem fair? And are there some patterns, some indicators that you have stronger feelings about than others? So in this process, you're going from data points to people's experiences and values. And that's actually where the work lies, the work of planning and doing the planning in cooperation with the stakeholders. And just this reminder, the data will often come in forms that can be intimidating to some people because they're unfamiliar. A big part of your job is to take the data and make it vivid and meaningful. So, slide. We've been talking about the baseline data's role within your planning process, but we also have to keep in mind maintaining transparency for the larger community. And that means communicating a broad-based community snapshot in the form of like a report. And this report should include details about your process and your stakeholder-defined indicators, but also a broader overview of where your community stands on energy, environment, how burdens and benefits are distributed. And when you have this information compiled, it's useful to think about how to package it for different kinds of stakeholders in the larger community, the power holders, the frontline groups, the general public. And in general, next slide. And I know you know this, but it's still nice to remind people who work with data a lot. It's useful to use a variety of methods for representing data. So some classic methods are here. Traditional graphs, using gaps, highlighting actual data points and targets on the same graphic and using arrows to highlight gaps. Using meaningful, evocative or familiar units, and of course maps. Now, with a smaller stakeholder group, like in your planning process, you'll have opportunities to use actual conversation to move from data to experiences and stories. But when producing reports for the larger community, it's harder to check on how people are absorbing and processing the information. So it's nice to make that extra effort. Okay, so we want to take a break from us talking and hear from you about which indicators do or would make up your city's baseline, and what do you do with data? And from those cities who have received baseline data sets from us, we'd like to hear something about how you're interpreting them. So I'm going to hand this off to Lacey to facilitate the discussion.
Thanks, Ted. So yeah, we're going to start moving into a little bit more conversation around baseline indicators. So Eric sent around a list a couple days ago and asked all of you to review this list of indicators of clean energy action, kind of common actions that we've seen, and ask you to come prepared with 2 indicators that you thought were most important to your stakeholders. Obviously, in a full kind of scenario planning, you'll work with your community to choose those indicators. But for the sake of today, we ask you to really just think about your community and pick those that you think are most important. And so what we would like to do is hear a little bit from y'all. If you've been on any webinars or trainings with me recently, you'll probably be familiar with my current favorite Zoom tool, the Annotate tool. And we're going to use this little feature to be able to put some stamps on to this slide. So if you go up to the top of your Zoom screen and click View Options, right next to the kind of green viewing button, there is a drop-down menu option that says Annotate. And if you click on that, it pulls up a little bar that basically has kind of like a Microsoft Paint old school options that allow you to write, draw, stamp directly onto our slides. So what I would like to have you do is use the stamp feature, which has a little check mark on it, and add check marks, hearts, stars, your preference on the 2 indicators that you thought were most important to your community on this slide. And just a note, you need to be in the full Zoom version for this to work. If you're just logged in through the browser, you might not have access to it, but if you drop your answers in the chat, one of us can add some stars for you just in case so that you're counted. So let's see if folks had kind of similar ones or where you fell. All right, I'm seeing a whole bunch of stars next to racial composition. I'm seeing eviction, housing type, percentage of renters. Let's see, some down in the income characteristics. Votes for basically all of those, poverty, the Gini index, number of individuals utilizing the SNAP program. It's a good one, households with living costs exceeding 30% of their income. Give you a minute or 2 more here. But see a few votes for current lack of health insurance. I feel like that's one that is definitely very timely right now. So I think with that, we'll move to looking a little bit more at some indicators. Let me clear off this slide, save it, and then there we go. Eric, can you move forward? And I think I'll pass it. I think Yo comes next and is going to talk a little bit more. Yo and then Lisa from Las Cruces about some of their experience with the indicators.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lacey. Here you have an example of Las Cruces energy burden map. We are going to have her talk next, so it seemed like a good one to use as an example. Everyone should have a version of their cities for Tier 1 in this spreadsheet that Eric is nicely pulling up for us. So the energy equity map, links are to the left, and then you can see which cities had mapped which indicators in that kind of big row in the middle. To the right, we also have links to Tier 1 city calculators to actually look at energy scenario pathways, but we'll talk about that later. For the energy equity maps, I did also want to highlight that we have an energy equity map indicator sources and definitions link at the top. So you can click on that and actually see what the definitions for all the additional equity indicators and where our sources and years for where those indicators come from. So if you could go back to the map for me, if you don't mind. Great. So the top is just a definition of energy burden. The way that GreenLink defines it is how much an individual pays towards their energy bills. Please note that this is electricity and natural gas here. And we kind of use the conventions that a household is considered in high burden if their energy burden exceeds 6%, or they're in energy poverty if their bills exceed 10% of their annual income. And note that the national average is about 3%. So if you don't mind scrolling down just a bit, the top two maps are energy burden, but they're kind of two different looks at it. So the one on the left shows you the median energy burden by each census tract. So Eric, if you don't mind hovering over one of the census tracts, there you go. You can actually see the median income for that census tract as well as the average percentage of burden. And the little legend at the top will tell you the range of burdens that you guys see in that census tract or in the map. So just 2 points on just logistics. If you click that little magnifying glass part to the left, it's a search bar, so you can zoom in further in your city or in your county if you need to. It does take a second to reload. Sometimes Tableau is finicky, so you'll have to forgive us. The other functions that are helpful is if you press the little house looking icon, it will zoom you back out to the main view. So if you ever get lost in your map, that is a super useful button to have. And then if you click that little right facing arrow button on the bottom, using that 4-pointed arrow thing is usually the best way to navigate around the maps. So on the right-hand side, the map on the right-hand side is a slightly different view of energy burden for each census tract. So the one on the left-hand side, again, is just like the average burden for each census tract. The one on the right actually shows you the approximate the approximate number of households living in a certain amount of energy burden. So for example, the average energy burden in Las Cruces is 5.4%. So you're seeing all the households that have energy burdens above 5.4%. And if you hover over one of them, it'll actually show you the number of households and the percentage of those actually living above 5.41%. If you go to that slider bar on the top and you wanted to see people, for example, living in energy poverty, you can drag that little circle button or press the arrows to actually change it to 10%, which is the threshold for energy poverty. And that will actually change the map, and you can see where there are higher concentrations of people living in energy poverty on the map. If you scroll down below, you can see the 2 additional indicators that each city asked for, and those are different depending on the city. So I think I am done, and I will turn it over to Las Cruces.
Oops. Hi, everybody. This is Lisa. And I've been able to play with this data for a day or two. So thank you very much. I love data, so this has been fun. If you could help me by going to view at Las Cruces on the top right-hand map, which I found super helpful, keep it at 10% and zoom in through the magnifier to Las Cruces. Yeah, or that way. And then you'll have to move it up a little. Yeah, oops, no. So, one of the things that we were trying to do is, it was tough to pick 2 indicators because we think there's so many variables that are involved. And so the thing that I wanted to do is, if I thought about how I could influence policy or practices, one of the things are, do I target renters and landlords, or do I target owners? And then the other thing was fuel type, because our municipality provides natural gas. We have an IOU providing electricity. So when I first looked at the households living over 10%, it's a pretty pink map, but the ones that are most significant are the ones that are in the very center of the area. You can see the triangle at the very bottom. That's the university, so that tells a unique story. But if you travel up to where there's a triangle 3 census tracts up, yes, thank you, you're good. You can see this area has at least 50% that are in energy poverty. And this whole area is the infill area of the city, and our poverty level, poverty area is most concentrated in this area. So learning to disaggregate it was very interesting. And one of the things that we did is we went, if you can go over to the electricity and primary fuel, is we wanted to see whether or not who could do an intervention, and by who was using electricity. But what we found is that if you looked at those 3 census tracts with the triangles, that there wasn't, that electricity wasn't really in use, that natural gas was, and we don't have programs for that. So that was a red flag for me right there, that our utility, our municipal utility is not really doing much. It also highlighted that I'm not using the right data, because we don't have a problem with heating fuel. We have a problem with being cool. And so one of the things that, and then in the last map was about whether it was, the one in the bottom right-hand corner, was the one about whether it was single family rentals or owners. And with the help of working with our section with HUD, we found just from this data that the problem areas for us are severe low income areas that are high energy poverty, that are natural gas users, that are primarily renters, single homes, mostly Hispanic, live in houses. And this is data that we drilled down for further, that was beyond the scope of this, because we were so curious, that it's mostly Hispanics that live in houses that were built before 1980, 1949, and that the vacancy rates were up to 50%, and there was some problems with substandard housing. So just from looking at this collection of data, we were able to define our target population. So I hope that's what you were asking me to tell you about.
Yeah, that was awesome that you were able to dive into that level, and that, you know, just starting to see some of those made you ask questions and want to go deeper. So hopefully you'll be able to find that information really useful to really target in programs going forward.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of questions that you get with every new data that's revealed, for sure.
Yeah, you look at something, you're like, why is that? Huh, I wonder. Maybe it's connected to this. Let's look at that factor. So So Eric, I think
so I think we have a few more minutes if others want to share their experiences or their impressions of these maps. I know most of you only received them just yesterday, and you probably haven't fully had time to process them, but it'd be great to get any reflections or questions you have about the maps, whether they're your own maps or just something you found insightful in reviewing someone else's map. It would be great to hear from one or two additional cities.
I do have a question. You had us pick a couple of the indicators. How many indicators do you really play with when you're doing a full analysis?
Sure. So we currently have the ability to map about 50 or 60 indicators, but most cities, that is way too much and way too overwhelming. So when we actually look at how many indicators cities usually map, it's usually around 5 to 7. In the new equity indicator platform that we're building out, we're aiming to have about 10 equity indicators in the platform, with adding a few more in. For the analyses, it honestly really just kind of depends on what analyses and what the use case for the city is. But I think for the actual maps itself, there is a sweet spot around like 6 and 10. Not beyond that, it gets really overwhelming for people.
Lisa, have you been able to think at all about what you might do differently after looking at some of these maps?
You credit me with a lot.
I know.
Diving in
you only had a day to look at them, but
well, I think of mostly just taking a slice of the task on. It's like looking at how there's renters there and a high vacancy rate. Should it be something that we work with landlords to try to incentivize, getting houses ready, or some connection with that, or there's a new international energy conservation code that we're adopting. Should I focus on where to incentivize the introduction of that? Could this be used to talk about marketing our living wage? I mean, there's a lot of different applications for it. And so at this point, we were just trying to see what it tells and what it could support. So we're not at that stage yet. But we definitely want to scale up our interventions for the low and moderate income households, because for our resiliency work, that's super important.
yeah, fair enough. I know that that was a big question, but I think those were some really interesting options to think about. And I especially liked how you were even thinking broader than just energy and thinking about living wage campaigns and how this intersects with other work that you might be doing.
Well, I think sheltering in place now with resiliency after COVID just makes everything fall into place.
Yeah, as if you weren't already thinking about how important the home is, it's even more important now when folks are really hunkered down. All right. I think, Eric, should I turn it back to you, or do we want to try to hear from one other person? Got any takers?
Yeah, happy to spend another minute or two if people want to share responses on any of these questions. I'd be curious in this anybody has thoughts on this last piece about how you might want to use this information to engage or communicate with stakeholders. It'd be great to hear any insights on that.
So this is Patricia from Miami-Dade County. I have to admit that I haven't been able to play with the data yet. I shared it with my team, and they provided some big feedback that we will give it to you later on. But one of the things that we wanted to do is we think that energy and healthy living are correlated. So that's why we asked for the asthma indicator, because we think there is an opportunity, and right now with COVID even more so, to say if you do green building, if you do energy efficiency, if you do energy conservation, you are not only reducing the energy burden, but you also may be reducing exposure to healthy issues, mold, mildew, and many other things that people perhaps with asthma may have been greatly impacted. So we wanted to see if there is a correlation there so that we can start talking about solutions, not only the problem, but solutions. So that's our thought trend there, but again, we haven't had really much chance to look at the maps in depth and see if we have. I know for sure the asthma map, it's not complete, so we may need a little tweaks here and there. The data wasn't all available, so we'll see. But just wanted to share that those are our thoughts on how we can engage and communicate with the stakeholders.
Great, thanks for sharing insights, everyone, on baseline results. I think we're going to transition to talking about developing scenarios. So as a reminder, we touched on this last time, but scenarios, we can think of them as possible futures, and how this relates to our baseline is described in this figure. So in this example, we're looking at a scenario that is being measured using an indicator of related to greenhouse gas emissions. We have a baseline that has been developed, and for 2020, there's an established understood value. And then this figure is describing a range of numerous possible futures that, that could be developed based on which scenarios are pursued. From the reference scenario, which is business as usual trends, if nothing different was done and trends just continued as they are. And then there are intervention scenarios, a variety of different mixes, in this case, of different technical interventions for mitigating climate change. So this is just one visual way to think about scenarios. Another way to think about it is scenarios as a combination of actions, different actions as levers, right? So like that in that previous graph, we were talking about a lot of different interventions, different kinds of building or energy supply interventions. You could also think about how much of each of those kind of interventions you're doing more or less. What would be the possible future outcomes from different levels of work and those actions, and different combinations of including different actions together. And so when you're developing scenarios, it's important to think about what level of detail we should be focused at when we say action. So I want to make the argument that we want to be looking at what we're calling actions, which are kind of a middle ground between very abstract and very concrete. So probably concepts that are too abstract is just understanding energy supply or transportation. But concepts that would be too specific are specific policies or programs. So you don't necessarily at this point want to get into the detail of policy design, community solar, which you then have to think about business model and financing and a variety of different policy specific mechanisms. When you're developing a scenario, you want to focus on the action level, which are generally technical interventions and an understanding of who they will impact. So a couple different ways to think about scenario development for the purposes of communicating with stakeholders. So one option is thinking about action spaces. So this works really well when you have one or two dimensions of different options. So in this example, you have 4 different general quadrants of action on efficiency and renewables, thinking about a scenario that would be low in both of them or high in both of them, or a third scenario that would be low in one and high in the other, and a fourth that would be the opposite. So this sort of approach is really helpful if you only have 1 or 2 actions, or if you can cluster actions by their societal effects. Really nice to be able to communicate and think about, and that's particularly helpful with stakeholders. Here's another example of that. This is from a spatial planning exercise, land use planning, which lends itself well to visuals, which is something that's more difficult to do in a lot of cases with energy planning, although as we talked about with the baseline data, there are ways to do it. So this is a spectrum from low density to high density, and different ways to visualize what that would look like and details of those different scenarios. But in a lot of cases, you have more than 2 actions that you want to be able to consider. So it's important to think about different ways to keep that visual and to keep it tangible to stakeholders. So 2 different options here is thinking about yes and no for different actions as you're defining different scenario options, or a kind of slider panel version where you can dial up or dial down the level of activity in a particular action, low, medium, high, or even more specific. So here's an example of that first option. This is from Holland, Michigan's now at this point outdated energy efficiency and conservation strategy, where they had 4 different scenarios, which had looked at a combination of 10 different action options. And interesting to look at as one thing to remark and to think about is how these actions are described. Most of these are described in a pretty technical way, and probably these definitions were developed by consultants and not by the stakeholders themselves, and may have actually been somewhat a hindrance to engaging with stakeholders. So that's another important thing to be thinking about, is just how you describe the actions and how you describe the scenarios. When you're putting together scenarios, similar to this question that Yo was addressing on the number of indicators, it's important to think about a manageable number of scenarios. So you definitely want to have a business as usual scenario that you can compare change to, right? If nothing different happens, where are we likely to be going? And then ideally at least 2 options that reflect active change. We could do this to change things, or we could do this to change things. It's okay to have more than 2, but try to use as few as possible, because the more you have, the more difficult it will be for stakeholders to be able to differentiate between them. It's also really helpful perhaps to think about labeling these and giving these scenarios names, like high intervention or modest effort, or even things that are much more descriptive than that. I think that can be really helpful with being able to clearly label and describe the characteristics of different scenarios. And then finally, your scenario should be driven by the values of your planning process. So all active change scenarios should be defined as improvements over the business as usual. So those improvements, it's a positive direction of the indicators you've selected that are critical to measuring your values that you've already defined. And a couple of other key points. This question will always come up, and it comes up all the time. Money, how do you pay for it? How far will our money take us? And I would strongly encourage you at this point in the planning process to not be thinking about costs. At this point, your goals should be driving your scenarios, not costs. Thinking about how you get to those goals should be how this is structured. You'll have plenty of time to think about budgets and finance later when you're selecting actions and when you're actually working on implementation. But don't let that drive your efforts at this point. I think it's also really important to recognize that many of the more equitable scenarios may require more upfront investment. And it makes sense because more people are receiving benefits, but it also requires new ways to communicate about the value of what you're doing. And one of those key tools around communicating costs and benefits is cost effectiveness. This is a tool that is particularly important in the energy planning space and can be as narrowly defined as financial return on investment or as broadly defined as externalities can be quantified. And so for your efforts, I would encourage you to aim for the more inclusive definitions, thinking about how as many environmental and social externalities as possible that you can include in the benefits that you're looking at, whether that's the social cost of carbon, whether it's the cost of inequality, jobs and economic opportunity, thinking of ways to internalize that into your cost benefit analyses. And finally, just one particularly important point when we're thinking about equitable planning. This is the point at which you should start thinking about distributional parameters. You should be thinking about the different actions I'm including in my scenarios, how are they defined, and who is impacted by the actions, both the costs in terms of who pays, and also the direct benefits who is receiving those, as well as the indirect benefits. And so at this point, you also want to be making sure, again, with indicators, that you know your indicators. You should be selecting scenario parameters and action parameters and modeling tools that you can use to influence or to assess the distributional impacts. So depending on what your indicators are, those impacts may be geography, race, income, other dimensions. And there are a variety of different explicit distributional parameters in action design that you can put into how those actions are defined. So whether that's a geographically targeted intervention, a means tested intervention, or it's a first come first serve program, there's a variety of different ways these issues of distributional parameters of who pays and who benefits can be built into the actions you're including in your scenarios. So another just example to drive this point home, metrics really do matter and this is why we've spent so much time on the baseline indicators. And when you think about, thinking about how, what drives the action in your plan. So many of you have probably seen a version of this diagram before that describes equity and different perceptions of reality and how different people are treated in our socioeconomic systems. This also is, I think, a helpful way to think about action design too. This is an example that's looking specifically at energy efficiency programs. But the thing here to emphasize is the metrics themselves. So in the traditional energy efficiency model, the metrics that's prioritized are, and the people that are prioritized are those buildings that have high energy consumption. The goal is to reduce energy consumption as much, to reduce energy, system energy costs. And in a more equity-focused model, you'd be focused on households with high energy burden because you're focusing on a key metric around the economic benefit and the social benefit of improving energy efficiency. Neither one's right or wrong, but understanding the balance of that and how the metrics you selected for your planning process will influence these outcomes. And just finally, one example related to this. Here's a tool related to poverty reduction developed by the Center for Neighborhood Technology. Here's a scenario for Chicago. And it fits the same pattern that we've just talked about. So there's an indicator here that you set a goal related to poverty reduction. There are a variety of actions that you can select from. And within those actions, there are parameters you can set, right? And this tool is designed to enable you to include and to change distributional design parameters. In this case, jobs accessible to people below poverty and the assumed wage of those jobs. So, focusing on an action of jobs and transportation where 0% of those jobs are going to people below poverty is not going to have an impact on poverty reduction. Sounds obvious, but this is a piece that's too often skipped in scenario design. Just want to emphasize the importance of that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ted to talk more about modeling scenarios. And I've talked about some of the principles of developing them.
All right, thanks. So slide. So scenario planning, right, requires us to predict how different potential actions lead to different possible futures. And, you know, we do this all the time in our daily lives. This morning, I predicted how having 0, 1, or 2 coffees would affect my productivity and general stress level. And I chose 0 based on my predictions, which I made entirely in my own head. But for city level actions, we have a lot of complexity and a lot of the issues are technical. And so we have to turn to explicit modeling. And though we'd love to give you step-by-step instructions for modeling the outcomes of actions, every indicator requires a different modeling approach. And so instead, we'll have to talk about what modeling tools are available to you. So slide. So there are dozens of software tools out there, many of them free of charge to use. And we'll be sending you a list of resources that we've collected. And in that list, there are pointers to useful modeling tools. And the ones in this slide are just some prominent ones. But I know it's confusing. There are a lot of modeling tools, and it can be hard to know how to evaluate all the information that you're given about platforms and use cases and software requirements and features. And our advice for sort of kind of parsing through that information is, in the beginning, to focus on what each tool takes in as inputs and produces as outputs. So just look at a tool as being inputs becoming outputs. So for example, the EPA's Cobra tool. Cobra is co-benefits risk assessment. And what it boils down to is it's a tool that takes in emission reduction actions and it produces as outputs projected impacts on public health. So if your stakeholders have identified public health indicators as being important to them, this is probably a useful tool for you to take a closer look at. So here's an example of the kinds of projections that it was used for in the Minneapolis climate plan. They looked at achieving particular goals in energy efficiency and vehicle miles traveled, and used Cobra to produce projected impact on different mortality rates and ER visits, asthma, work days, that sort of thing. Now, okay, so next slide. So I'm gonna take a step back and get a little abstract for a second and talk about modeling, because in general, a model can be general, that is, it can be appropriate in many different places or situations. It can be realistic, that is, its underlying logic can really closely mirror the actual mechanisms that underlie the dynamics that you're trying to understand. It can be precise, that is, it can be built to make really pinpoint numerical predictions. And the different strengths have different requirements. Precision-heavy models require good, precise input data. Realistic models often need good, detailed, local contextual information about how a community works. And general models often require some comfort with making simplifying assumptions and an openness to interpreting results. And the thing is, slide, no model is good at all three. Models usually have to sacrifice one of these strengths in order to excel at the other two. Some sacrifice realism, and so they're built on curve fitting and extrapolating from data. Some sacrifice generality, so they're precise and they're realistic, but they only work for a particular situation, and it takes a lot of work to port them into a different location or application. And some models sacrifice precision for generality and realism. So what I want to suggest, and it's a mild suggestion because your mileage may differ, but next slide, is that you think of the intersection of the general and the realistic as the sweet spot for scenario modeling. So to emphasize, I'm suggesting that you not hold on too tightly to precision. And the reason is that in sustainability work, good data can be hard to find. And if you give a high precision model iffy data, you'll get sort of iffy results. And part of the problem, of course, is that it'll look like precise results, but they're actually, iffy. And the other thing is that, well, so back up a sec. And scenario planning isn't usually about hitting numerical targets anyway. It's about big trends. So you want asthma to go down by a lot. And whether it's like 15% or 18%, it's not so important. Okay, so here's an example, also from the Minneapolis Climate Plan. And I just want to show you that in this public report, what they're showing is predictions for a set of indicators that they're expressed purely in terms of direction and rough magnitude of change, these little triangles. So this first one, obesity, diabetes, and other chronic diseases, they're saying that it's possible that these could go down by a little bit. But the next one, respiratory and cardiovascular diseases, they're saying that it's likely to go down by a lot. So for the kinds of decisions that your stakeholder group is going to be making, sort of weighing their values and concerns against the predictions that these models make. All I'm saying is that direction and rough magnitude can often be enough. And in that sweet spot of generality and realism, you need a willingness to interpret and make assumptions, and you need good local information about what makes a community work. Both these kinds of requirements bring us back to the need for authentic stakeholder engagement, for authentic involvement and commonality of understanding. Now, beyond inputs and outputs, there are some other things, of course, to look at. And so here's a list of some of the other questions that you might want to ask. Now, some of these questions are relevant to whether you'll be able to use the tool. Like, does it provide default data if there's some piece of data that I can't find? And some of it is relevant to whether the tool is even relevant to you. Like this granularity question, how detailed are the data that it requires and that it produces? And how much granularity do I actually need for my stakeholders to, to evaluate a scenario? Remember that often greater detail in the data is not actually that useful to your understanding, and it's actually just a hassle. Now, there's this famous saying, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And when modelers say this, usually they're reminding you that no model perfectly reflects reality, but we can still use models. But I want to use it to make one last point in my section, which is that models should be seen not just as not at all as embodying or even driving a planning process, but just as something that's useful. So in this Venn diagram are a lot of the things that you have to do to run an effective, inclusive, equitable planning process. And the modeling is just a part. And I say this partly as a way of getting to say that if there's some information that a model doesn't give you, but you still need it or your stakeholders still want to know about it, then find it by other means other than the model. Sometimes there's a tendency to shape a project around what the model can do. And that's a mistake. It's sort of like building a bookcase using only a saw because you couldn't find a hammer. You could do it and it would hold your books for a while, but it won't hold up when a truck rolls by.
Well, in the interest of time, I'm going to move us to Kate, who I think actually might be able to talk a little bit about DC's experience using scenario outputs for stakeholder engagement. So she might be able to talk a little bit about how they've communicated some of those different scenarios to different stakeholders and what the challenges have been. So Kate, we'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Lacey. I assume you can hear me. Show me a thumbs up if you can.
You're good.
All right, great. So I'm Kate Johnson. I am with Washington, D.C., and I am going to attempt to summarize some of our carbon neutrality planning as it relates to this conversation in like 5 minutes. So I'm going to go really fast in hopes that we actually have some time for questions and discussion. You can go to the next slide. I should note that photo was not taken recently. That was an Open Streets event in the fall. DC does not look like that right now. So when we were starting out with our carbon neutrality strategy, we realized and really wanted to center this around the fact that carbon neutrality isn't just a target for us, it's a vision. And so we're working to make sure that we root the strategy in community values and priorities. And we find the linkages between those goals and a zero carbon future. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we're trying to do that. You can go to the next slide. So this is just the obligatory snapshot of our emissions. It probably looks like many cities, but I will note that we don't have any industry. And so we're really looking at buildings, transportation, and waste. And even that, it's largely transportation and buildings that we're looking at in our planning. You can go to the next slide. And this is how we're doing so far. So we have a target to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2032 and to achieve carbon neutrality and climate resilience by 2050. Our emissions have gone down about 30% since we started tracking them in 2006, but we've got a long way to go to reach our 2032 and 2050 targets. Go to the next slide. So the carbon neutrality strategy for us is really a next step in our planning. We will release that strategy by the end of 2020, but it really builds on planning we've been doing all the way back since 2013. So Clean Energy DC is our plan for achieving our 50% by 2032 goal, and Climate Ready DC is our plan for climate resilience. And then importantly, last year we updated our comprehensive sustainability plan, which we now call Sustainable DC 2.0. We're drawing a lot on the community engagement that was done in that planning process. We had more than 3,000 conversations with community members to really guide the vision and the strategy for what we may call carbon-free DC. You'll notice we use a lot of different terms in this deck, and that's intentional. We haven't settled on a title yet, and so we're kind of seeing, testing things out and seeing what works. You go to the next slide. So based on Sustainable DC 2.0, we're proposing a vision for 2050 that is actually much broader than just being carbon-free. And these are some of the values that came out of the engagement we did for Sustainable DC. And also, that planning process provided us many of the baseline indicators around race and equity that we were actually discussing earlier. So we're not having to sort of reinvent the wheel in doing that work, which is great. So you can go to the next slide. So shifting to, next slide, how we're actually trying to get there and how we're developing this strategy. So I'm actually really excited to be sharing this with this group because I think our approach was really informed by a lot of conversations we had with USDN and Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance members over how to take a more people-centered approach to developing this strategy. So it's definitely based on lived experience as much as technical analysis. And right now we're at the step where we're starting to identify some of the existing barriers to achieving what we earlier modeled in our technical modeling assessment. So we started with the community values that we heard from Sustainable DC. We've done some technical modeling, and now we're having in-depth community conversations around the barriers. And fortunately, we have a cohort of residents that's been meeting for the last more than 2 years around racial equity and energy democracy issues. And so we've brought our carbon neutrality strategy conversation to that group. And so far, we've had some really great conversations that are going to eventually inform the policy roadmap that will maybe the foundation of this strategy. Next slide. So it wouldn't be a case study on scenario planning without one of these charts that shows you the scenarios that we modeled. The reality is when you're trying to get to carbon neutrality, you kind of have to do everything. So our scenarios weren't really about picking and choosing different actions because we learned pretty quickly we had to do them all. But the scenarios we chose were how quickly we actually implement some of those actions. So the three scenarios you see here are our current trajectory, which is based on policy that we passed last year. And so we're already going to see a lot of progress. And then two scenarios that get to carbon neutrality. One that we call gradual, although it's still pretty aggressive, and then one that is more accelerated. And the accelerated scenario gets us to an 81% reduction by 2032, just to tell you how accelerated that is. But I think as Ted was saying, this chart, you can go to the next slide, Eric. this chart is not particularly accessible to the residents and the communities that we want to engage in developing the strategy. And we learned a couple things from Clean Energy DC that we're applying here. We built a Tableau site for Clean Energy DC, and actually I think Max Sykes is on the webinar, and in his former role helped us build that Tableau site, so thank you. We used it a lot, but it actually wasn't the best tool for trying to do community engagement. It didn't inform the policies as much as it was a really helpful tool for, you know, city staff. So we had to figure out how we're going to communicate what we learned from the modeling in an accessible way and use it to get meaningful input. And so what we did is we started to pull out key milestones that allow people to envision sort of what the scenarios will look and feel like. And so you can see some of the milestones that we're starting to talk with residents about. And it's around things that people live and feel like their home, how they get to work, the bills that they pay. And we're going to use a different tool this time in communicating it. It's still under development. We're going to do a story map that walks people through the scenarios in more of a narrative format, and then follow that up with a survey or an input tool. We were already thinking of doing a story map, but that became even more important because of COVID-19, because we really have to try to figure out how we're going to get input online, as well as through some of the virtual community conversations we're having. And then next and final slide. So we're very intentionally calling this a strategy rather than a plan. And that's because rather than having sort of highly prescriptive actions, we intend to lay out a framework for how we're going to evaluate future policies and programs that's rooted in equity and resilience benefits. So we haven't quantified these yet for the various actions, but the idea is that we would do that as we develop new policies in the future. And so we're truth testing these criteria through some of our engagement and community conversations. And I will stop there. I don't know if I did manage to do that in 5 minutes, but hopefully we have a little bit of time for questions.
Yeah, please, if there are any questions, we have a few minutes. People have any questions for Kate?
Hi, Kate. This is Eric from Columbia, Missouri. Really interested in if you have any more that you'd like to say about how you plan to use the story map to support outreach and engagement and representing that. It's something we're also interested in doing in the current environment. Thanks.
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Eric. We are planning to use it both just hosting it on our website and driving people to it to let them kind of self-orient to the strategy and then provide feedback through a survey tool that we haven't totally figured out yet. But we also plan to use it kind of live as we're doing virtual kind of engagement sessions. We think it can be a helpful tool to actually walk people through the strategy and some of the technical analysis we've done and in a more kind of lively narrative way. So we're planning to use it kind of both. Eventually, and we'd actually thought we would use the story map in like live community meetings too. Those probably aren't going to happen anytime soon. So we're thinking of it more as like a virtual thing that we would share.
This is Christopher from Salt Lake City. And Kate, thank you so much for sharing. I've really enjoyed looking through your materials. I think they're very inviting. One question I wanted to ask you about is I've been really intrigued by this idea of, you know, when you talk about a framework for evaluating potential plans to meet the target. Looking at how a given strategy, who it benefits, where do the benefits fall and where do the costs fall? So I'm curious if you have thought about or done some, taken a look at, hey, this strategy A, primarily has benefits that fall across our community in this way, and the way it's paid for is really coming from these parts of our community. Have you taken any of this to that kind of a level?
Yeah, another really great question. That is definitely a theme that has come out in some of the conversations we've had with our energy democracy cohort. It's coordinated by a group here in DC called Empower DC. And that is very much like their approach to a lot of the issues that they work on. And so, for example, we had a conversation around housing, and we got into a lot of really interesting kind of deep dives around the difference for folks who live in public housing versus, voucher-based assistance versus, and thinking through that lens, who benefits from various programs? Is it their landlord? Is it them? Is it, a lot of these folks aren't paying utility bills directly. And so it was a really rich conversation, and definitely, had some elements of talking about the politics and the power around the development sector here in DC in some really interesting ways. I see a question from Pega about where we got the criteria, the equity and resilience criteria. So that was really based on the Sustainable DC engagement that we did. So we did lots of questions, lots of surveys around community priorities and values that raised a lot of those issues. And so we sourced them from there, but our goal is to take them back to the community and make sure we got it right.
Nice. Thanks so much, Kate, for sharing this. And I imagine people have other questions. Is it all right if people follow up by email with you, I imagine, as well?
Yes, absolutely. And I don't think I put my email in the slides, but hopefully, Eric, you guys can share it as a follow-up.
Sure, can do.
Great.
All right, and with that, I think we want to begin the transition to the end, which is to begin talking about the tool that we're going to be asking you to use between now and the next session to begin developing these test scenarios. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt, who's going to describe the scenario calculator tool. And then after that, I will describe the specifics of the homework we're asking you to do with this tool. Matt?
Thanks, Eric. So what you have here is an example of a tool. We've put this all into Excel, but it's a scenario evaluation tool that we've used in a number of different cities. This one's a little simplified to kind of point us in the right direction here. But what it allows us to do is to take a look at what the current electricity consumption and the current gas consumption is by sector within a particular city. And then it allows us to manipulate how much of a specific clean energy potential we want to pursue within that city. So if we're saying right now in every city that's here, that's across the country, there's some amount of increased energy efficiency that could be happening. There's some amount of increased rooftop solar activity that could be happening. And so we're calculating what those levels are and determining what an achievable level is. So you normally start with like a technical assessment, then an economic assessment, and then an achievable. So it all funnels down to that. And then we're dialing in a value from 0 to 100% to say, how much of that do you want to try to achieve in the next decade? So when you plug in that number, the model will calculate what that value is. On the residential efficiency one, we've also put an additional toggle here. So we have the level of efficiency investments that are going towards low-income communities. The baseline is set at low, which represents the current mix. So if we set it at low and we increase the amount of residential energy efficiency activity going on, it's essentially the same as just increasing the amount of energy efficiency work happening through existing pipelines. If we set it towards medium, we're increasing those budgets to get to be 25% of all of the energy efficiency money that would be spent is now being directed towards the low-income communities. If we set it towards high, that number gets up to 50%. That changes the cost effectiveness and the carbon savings values, because generally working with those communities is a more expensive effort. And so we've tried to put some equivalencies here. The part where this becomes useful and how we've used it in town halls and with city council members and those types of audiences has been the equivalencies helps them kind of ballpark what it is we're looking at. And so how many homes are we talking about getting solar if we do 50%? Oh, about 1,700. Okay. How many cars are we taking off of the road? 3,000. All right. And then the other thing that we will focus on are those outputs at the bottom. So what's in the report card? And this has been really helpful for us when we're talking, especially in a community setting, where we find that in general, the public's pretty supportive of this kind of clean energy activity, but there's still a fear that things are going to be very expensive. And we're going to be showing cases here where a lot of that happens to do with what choices you make around which resources to pursue. And so there's ways you can design it to make it so that your overall benefits may not exceed the costs, but there's also plenty of ways to do it so that that is achieved, if that's a goal. Other things that are going to be presented down here are some basic outputs around how much clean energy is being deployed. And then we've also gone through the step to monetize the climate damages. So that's doing the social, we're applying the social cost of carbon to that to say how many tons of CO2 are being avoided, what's that worth in dollars. The last thing to point out there is that we do have some job creation values as well. And you'll see that those are differentiated between energy efficiency investments and solar investments. And we've tried to specify those. We have a handful of cities where we actually had specific local data where it's in. And there's also, in the case where that was not available, we've used national averages to populate that information. But that is giving us the full-time equivalent jobs that are coming as a result of these investments.
Perfect. Thanks, Matt. So I'm going to just quickly describe what we're asking you to do with this now that you've seen it. I want to point out that in this spreadsheet that was sent to you yesterday and that we'll resend after the session, in addition to the equity maps that Yo described at the beginning, these calculators that Matt just described are included here as well. So there's one for each of the 12 level 1 cities. And what we're asking everybody to do as homework from this, there's one critical thing is just to share your feedback on this session. That should take you 5 minutes. There's a link here. We'll resend that link around. But the core piece is to spend some time using one of these calculators. I see the question already in here about, for those that aren't level 1 cities, what we're encouraging you to do is if you have if your city's calculator if there's a custom one available, use that one. Or if it isn't, use one for a city that you think is similar to yours. Note that you can also adjust some of the baseline data, some of the baseline energy consumption data. So if you have that data for your own city that you want to include in a calculator for a city like yours, please go ahead and do that and then explore the different scenario options and their impacts using that tool. That we thought about creating a generic calculator, but decided it would actually be better to allow you to think about a city that's similar to yours instead of just a generic national calculator. So we're asking all of you, level 1 and level 2 participant cities, to spend some time with this, explore the options and choose the distributional parameter for residential energy efficiency, which of those high, medium, and low options, choose the level of achieved potential you're looking for in each of those 4 different intervention types, those 4 different action types. We are asking that if you are a level 1 city, that we definitely need you to send those to us. You can send either a copy of a saved version of the Excel calculator tool or a screenshot of your tool to Yo at the email address here by June 3rd, next week. The reason why so soon is because it's going to take time for the GreenLink team to create a more detailed assessment of the projected impact on your calculators for on your indicators for 2030 based on the scenario inputs you select. So providing both a intervention scenario based on your inputs and a business as usual scenario. So the 12 level 1 cities will be getting that more detailed impact projections. And we'll be sharing those impact projections out with the whole group before the next session. We'll try to do it earlier in the week so you have more time to review the results before the session. And we'll be looking for you to schedule some time to examine the scenario outcomes and think about what they would mean for your community. Either the scenario outcomes for your city itself, if yours, your calculator is one, your city is one of the tier level 1 cities, or to take a look at the outcomes for some of the other cities and think about implications for your planning process. So that's the homework, and we'll have time in just a minute or two if people have clarifying questions. We can follow up on that in just a minute. Just wanted to also highlight what else is coming up in session 3. Make sure this is on your calendar. There's appointments on your calendar for June 25th, 3:30 to 5 p.m. Eastern time. And make sure, and you can also make sure you register in advance for the Zoom meeting. We're going to be talking about interpreting the scenario outcomes that are going to come out of the use of the calculator. We're going to talk about how we evaluate, communicate scenario outcomes, and then focus on turning scenarios into equitable policies and actions. Also to highlight, this is going to be shared after the meeting by email, but we've mentioned that we've put together this resource list related to equitable clean energy planning. So it's a variety of different kinds of resources, from tools to guides. We're going to be sending this over by email. That's just kind of a curated, annotated bibliography of some of the best resources in this area. And with that, I just want to say thanks to all of you for participating. Thanks to our partners in making this possible, Summit Foundation and CUSP. And thanks all to our advisors, reviewers, and researchers who've helped contribute to this content.